Close your eyes and breathe in the cool, limestone shadows of the past. We are embarking on a journey through a shimmering cosmos of nearly 70 million words, where 32 million Greek whispers glow like distant stars. From the golden masks of Mycenae to the silent, heavy-lidded gaze of the Bartlett Head, we seek the beauty of a legacy that refused to fade. This is a classical continuum, drifting beyond translation into the heart of the ancient dawn. Let the silence guide you home. Close your eyes and let the weight of the modern world dissolve into the shadows of your room. Take a deep, slow breath and imagine the air becoming cooler, infused with the scent of wild thyme, crushed limestone, and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the sea. We are traveling back, far beyond the reach of memory, to a time when the geography of the Aegean was not a map of nations, but a tapestry of rugged isolation and shimmering possibility. The story of ancient Greece does not begin with the white marble of the Parthenon or the logic of the philosophers. It begins in the quiet, prehistoric mists where the earth and the water first dictated the destiny of a people. The landscape of Greece is a demanding architect. To understand the dawn of this civilization, one must first feel the jagged spine of the mountains that cover nearly 4/5 of the land. These are not merely hills. They are formidable barriers of limestone that carved the territory into isolated pockets, forcing early communities to look inward toward their own valleys or outward toward the endless blue of the Mediterranean. There were no great navigable rivers here like the Nile or the Tigris to unite the land. Instead, there was the sea, the wine-dark sea of the later poets, which acted as both a barrier and a bridge. In these early millennia, during the transition from the Neolithic period into the early Bronze Age, the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasonal rains and the sparse fertility of the thin soil. Small, autonomous villages began to dot the landscape, their inhabitants tilling the earth for barley and wheat, and tending to the silver-green groves of olive trees and the sprawling vines of grapes that would become the lifeblood of their culture. As the third millennium before the Common Era dawned, a profound transformation began to ripple across the islands of the Aegean. The discovery and mastery of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, shifted the balance of power and social complexity. On the large central island of Crete, a unique and vibrant civilization began to emerge, one that the archaeologists of the modern era would name after the legendary King Minos. The Minoans were a maritime people, their wealth and influence built not on the strength of fortress walls, but on the sophistication of their trade and the dominance of their navy. Imagine the great palace at Knossos, not as a ruin, but as a living, breathing labyrinth of multi-storied stone, wood, and vibrant plaster. It was a place of astonishing complexity, with light wells that allowed the sun to penetrate deep into the interior rooms and advanced drainage systems that whispered of a high degree of engineering skill. The walls of these palaces were not blank. They were windows into a world of elegance and nature. Vivid frescoes depicted lithe figures leaping over the backs of charging bulls, a ritual or sport that remains shrouded in mystery, and processions of figures carrying offerings in high-collared tunics. There are images of dolphins dancing across blue backgrounds and lilies swaying in a gentle, painted breeze. The absence of heavy fortifications around these Minoan palaces suggests a period of relative internal peace, protected by the wooden walls of their ships that patrolled the shipping lanes from the Levant to the coast of North Africa. They developed a script, known today as Linear A, to manage the vast bureaucracies of their palatial economies, a script that remains untranslated, keeping the intimate thoughts of the Minoans locked away in the silence of history. However, as the centuries turned towards 1600 BCE, the focus of power began to shift from the islands to the rugged mainland of the Peloponnese. Here, a different kind of society was rising, one characterized by strength, fortification, and a more martial spirit, the Mycenaeans. Unlike the open palaces of Crete, the Mycenaean citadels were perched upon high, rocky outcrops, surrounded by cyclopean walls, so named by later Greeks who believed only the one-eyed giants could have moved such massive stones. The most famous of these, Mycenae, stood as a sentinel over the Argive plain. To enter, one had to pass through the Lion Gate, where two massive stone lionesses stood guard above the lintel, their heads now lost to time, but their presence still radiating an undeniable authority. The wealth of the Mycenaeans was legendary, even in antiquity. When modern excavators first breached the grave circles within the citadel walls, they found a staggering display of funerary splendor. These were not the simple burials of the Neolithic past. Instead, they discovered warriors laid to rest with finely crafted bronze, swords inlaid with scenes of lion hunts in gold and silver. There were shimmering breastplates, ornate jewelry, and most famously, the funerary masks beaten from thin sheets of solid gold. These masks, with their closed eyes and stylized features, were intended to preserve the faces of the heroic dead for eternity. One of these, often attributed in legend to the High King Agamemnon, stares back at us with a frozen, regal intensity, bridging the gap between the archaeological reality of the Bronze Age and the epic myths that would later be sung by the poets. The Mycenaeans were not merely warriors. They were sophisticated administrators who adopted and adapted the Minoan palatial model. They developed their own script, Linear B, which, unlike its predecessor, has been deciphered. It reveals a world of meticulous record-keeping, lists of chariot wheels, inventories of perfumed oils, and the names of laborers and deities. This script tells us that the Mycenaeans were already speaking an early form of the Greek language, establishing a linguistic continuity that would survive the coming darkness. Their reach was vast, their pottery found as far afield as Sicily and the shores of the Black Sea, indicating a complex network of trade and diplomacy that connected the Aegean to the broader Mediterranean world. Yet, for all their gold and stone, the Mycenaean world was a fragile one. Their society was highly centralized, built around the figure of the wanax, or king, who sat at the heart of the palace in a great hall known as the Megaron. The Megaron was a sacred and political space, featuring a central hearth surrounded by 4 ornate columns, where the smoke of sacrifices rose toward a hole in the roof, and the king presided over the affairs of his people. It was a world of hierarchy and precision, where every jar of wine and every fleece of wool was accounted for. But the very complexity that allowed them to thrive also made them vulnerable to the tremors of change. As the 13th century BCE drew to a close, the high summer of the Bronze Age began to fade. The reasons remain a subject of intense debate among those who study the silent stones. Was it a series of devastating earthquakes that shook the foundations of the citadels? Was it a prolonged drought that withered the crops and sparked internal uprisings? Or was it the mysterious sea peoples spoken of in Egyptian records, raiders who disrupted the trade routes and brought fire to the coastal cities? Whatever the cause, the end was not a single event, but a slow, cascading collapse. One by one, the great palaces were burned and abandoned. The intricate bureaucracy vanished, the art of writing was lost, and the golden masks were buried under layers of ash and earth. The silence that followed was not the silence of a void, but the silence of a long, deep winter. The population dwindled, and the grand stone citadels became haunted ruins, their origins forgotten by the small, scattered communities that remained. Yet, even in this darkness, the seeds of what was to come were being protected. The stories of the great kings, the memories of the rich in gold Mycenae, and the echoes of the gods worshipped in the Megarons were being carried forward, not in writing, but in the breath of storytellers. The world was shrinking, becoming more local and more fragile, but the spirit of the Aegean was merely dormant, waiting for the first light of a new and different dawn to break over the horizon. As the embers of the Bronze Age citadels finally cooled, the land entered a period of profound quietude, a time when the grand narratives of kings and empires were replaced by the humble struggles of survival in a landscape that had become wild once more. The memories of the past were now shifting, transforming into the foundations of a mythology that would one day define the Western imagination. The transition was beginning, moving away from the era of heroes and into the long, starlit shadows of the Iron Age. As the long, starlit shadows of the Iron Age stretched over the Aegean, the silence was not merely an absence of sound, but a profound transformation of the human spirit. The fires that had consumed the great citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylus eventually gave way to a cold, enduring ash, and with that ash, the complex machinery of the Bronze Age vanished into the earth. The high kings, the Wanakes, who had once commanded vast bureaucracies from their frescoed throne rooms, were no more. The scribes who had meticulously recorded every jar of oil and every head of sheep in the sharp, angular strokes of linear B had disappeared, and with them, the very art of writing was erased from the collective memory of the Greek world for nearly 400 years. This was a time of radical simplification, an era when the pulse of civilization slowed to the rhythmic, seasonal toil of isolated farmsteads and small, kinship-based hamlets. Imagine the landscape now, stripped of its palatial grandeur. The once bustling trade routes that had linked the Aegean to the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of the Hittites had withered. The gold that had shimmered in the shaft graves was no longer imported. The ivory and lapis lazuli that had adorned the hilts of royal swords became legendary ghosts of a bygone era. In this new world, life was local, rugged, and intimate. The people who remained were the descendants of the Mycenaeans, yet they lived in a world where the monumental stone walls of their ancestors were seen as the work of giants, too vast to be the product of mere mortal hands. They shifted their reliance from the prestigious but brittle bronze to a new metal that required a different kind of mastery: iron. The Iron Age was born not of a desire for luxury, but out of necessity. Iron was more abundant in the Greek earth, but it was far more difficult to work, requiring higher temperatures and a more sophisticated understanding of the forge. The sound of the hammer on iron became the new heartbeat of the village, producing tools and weapons that were plain, functional, and durable, a reflection of the era itself. In the absence of writing, the history of the people did not die, it migrated. It moved from the clay tablet to the living breath of the singer, the Aeginos. In the dim light of the village hearth, these poets began to weave the fragments of the past into vast oral tapestries. They sang of the great walls of Troy, of the wrath of Achilles, and of the long, wandering journey of Odysseus. These were not yet the polished epics of Homer that we know today, but a fluid, evolving tradition where memory was a creative act. The technical details of Bronze Age warfare, the boar's tusk helmets and the great tower shields, survived in these songs, preserved like insects in amber, even as the singers themselves lived in humble dwellings of mud brick and thatch. This oral tradition became the cultural glue that held the scattered communities together, providing a shared identity in a world that had become fragmented. Yet, archaeology whispers that this dark age was never truly dark. It was merely a period of gestation. On the long island of Euboea, at a site known as Lefkandi, the Earth has yielded a discovery that challenges the notion of a total cultural collapse. Around 950 BCE, at a time when history supposedly stood still, a massive structure was raised on a hill overlooking the sea. It was a building of unprecedented scale for its time, nearly 50 meters long, with a porch of wooden columns that foreshadowed the great temples of the future. This was the Heroon, a monumental tomb and a testament to a lingering social hierarchy. Within its floor, researchers discovered the remains of a man cremated and placed in a bronze urn from Cyprus, an heirloom already ancient when it was buried, and a woman adorned with gold jewelry and a refined Babylonian gorget. Beside them lay the skeletons of 4 horses, sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife. The presence of such wealth and organized labor at Lefkandi reveals that even in the depths of the Iron Age, there were big men, local chieftains who could command resources and maintain ancestral links to the prestige of the East. The Heroon was not meant to last. Shortly after the burials, the entire building was dismantled and buried under a massive mound of earth, creating a permanent monument to a vanished authority. This site serves as a bridge, showing us that the seeds of the Greek polis, or city-state, were being sown in the competitive displays of these local elites. They were reclaiming the idea of the hero, molding the memories of the Mycenaean past to justify their own status in the present. As the centuries of silence progressed, a subtle shift began to manifest in the very objects of daily life. The pottery of this era, which archaeologists call proto-geometric, began to move away from the loose, floral, and marine motifs of the Minoan and Mycenaean past. Instead, the artists embraced a new, rigorous discipline. Using a multiple brush attached to a compass, they began to adorn their vessels with perfect concentric circles and semicircles. The lines became straight, the patterns mathematical and orderly. This was not a loss of skill, but a new way of seeing the world. It was an aesthetic of precision and logic, a visual language that sought to impose order on a chaotic environment. In the dark gloss of the clay and the sharp, rhythmic repetition of the circles, we see the first stirrings of the Greek desire for symmetry and proportion, the very foundations of the classical mind. While the material world was being redefined, the Greek language itself was undergoing a quiet evolution. The various dialects, Doric, Ionic, Aeolic, were beginning to solidify as populations migrated and settled across the Aegean and onto the coast of Asia Minor. This was a period of the Great Migrations, a slow, multi-generational movement of people seeking new land and better security. The Ionians moved toward the central Aegean islands and the Anatolian coast, carrying with them the traditions of the mainland, while the Dorians settled in the Peloponnese and Crete. These movements were not always peaceful, but they resulted in a vibrant, cultural mosaic that would eventually define the Greek world. The sea remained the constant companion, the highway that ensured that even in isolation, no community was ever truly alone. By the early 8th century BCE, the long winter of the Iron Age began to thaw. The population was rising, and the small hamlets were coalescing into larger, more stable communities. The need for a way to record property, laws, and the sacred songs of the poets became undeniable. But when writing returned, it did not come back as the clumsy, bureaucratic linear bee. Instead, through contact with Phoenician traders in the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, the Greeks encountered a revolutionary technology, the alphabet. They took the Phoenician consonantal script and made a brilliant, simple adaptation. They added vowels. In doing so, they created a system of writing that was phonetic, easy to learn, and capable of capturing the nuance and music of the spoken word. This was the spark that would ignite the Greek Renaissance. The return of literacy was not just a tool for merchants, it was a vessel for the soul. The oral songs of the Aewods could now be captured in stone and papyrus, freezing the legends of the Trojan War into the monumental forms of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The return of writing coincided with the first recorded Olympic Games in 776 BCE, an event that signaled a new era of Pan-Hellenic identity, where the scattered communities of the Aegean recognized themselves as part of a single, shared culture. The era of isolation was ending. The foundations of the polis were set, and the stage was being prepared for the rise of the citizen, the philosopher, and the legislator. The shadows were retreating, revealing a world that was no longer haunted by its past, but energized by the possibilities of its future, as the first rays of the archaic dawn began to touch the marble peaks of the mountains. As the first rays of the archaic dawn began to touch the marble peaks of the mountains, The landscape was no longer a collection of isolated ruins, but a laboratory of social experimentation. The return of literacy through the adapted Phoenician script was the spark, but the fuel was an unprecedented surge in population and a newfound hunger for order. The world was awakening from its long, geometric slumber, and the small, scattered hamlets of the Iron Age were coalescing into a revolutionary form of human organization, the polis. This was not merely a city-state in the modern sense of a geographic boundary. It was a koinonia, a community of citizens who shared a common identity, a common set of laws, and a sacred connection to the land they tilled. Imagine standing on a limestone ridge overlooking a fertile valley. Below you, the anatomy of the early polis is beginning to take shape. At its highest point stands the Acropolis, the high city, once a Mycenaean fortress but now transforming into the sacred residence of the gods. In the shadows of these rising temples, the agora, the open marketplace and assembly ground, pulsates with the rhythm of public life. Here, the silence of the previous centuries is replaced by the vibrant cadence of debate and the clinking of early currency, such as the distinctive silver obols that would eventually carry the prestige of city-states across the sea. Surrounding this urban core is the chora, the agricultural hinterland where the olive groves and vineyards stretch toward the horizon, providing the sustenance that allowed this new society to breathe. This era, however, was marked by a profound tension, a land hunger, or stenochoria that began to grip the growing populations. The rugged geography of Greece, while protective, offered only limited arable soil. This pressure pushed the Greeks back toward the wine-dark sea, but this time not as refugees, but as organized pioneers. This was the age of great colonization, a centuries-long movement that saw the establishment of apoikei, literally homes away, from the sun-drenched shores of Sicily and southern Italy, known as Magna Graecia, to the distant, frigid waters of the Black Sea. These were not subservient colonies in the imperial sense. Each was a new, independent polis, carrying the sacred fire and the ancestral customs of its mother city, yet destined to forge its own path in the wider Mediterranean world. The catalyst for these perilous voyages was often found in the mist-shrouded slopes of Mount Parnassus, at the Panhellenic sanctuary of Delphi. Here the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, would enter a trance and utter the enigmatic will of the god. Herodotus, in his sprawling Histories, captures the gravity of these moments, where kings and commoners alike sought divine sanction for their westward expansion. The oracle acted as a central nervous system for the Greek world, directing the flow of people and ideas, and ensuring that despite their political independence, the Greeks remained bound by a shared spiritual map. It was through this expansion that the Greeks encountered the others, the Lydians, the Phrygians, and the Egyptians, each encounter refining their own sense of what it meant to be Hellenic in contrast to the barbarian world. As these communities flourished, the internal structure of the polis began to shift. The old aristocratic families, the well-born, who claimed descent from the heroes of the Bronze Age, found their authority challenged by a new class of wealthy non-aristocrats and a revitalized peasantry. This social friction gave rise to the Hoplite Revolution. Military power was no longer the sole domain of the aristocratic knight on horseback. It now belonged to the heavy infantryman, the hoplite, who stood shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx. This formation required absolute discipline and mutual reliance. A man's life depended on the shield of the comrade to his left. This military equality inevitably demanded political recognition. If a man was expected to bleed for the polis, he expected to have a voice in its governance. In many cities, this transition was facilitated by the rise of tyrants. In the archaic period, a tyrant was not necessarily the cruel despot of later imagination, but an ambitious leader who often seized power with the support of the common people to break the stranglehold of the narrow aristocracy. These rulers often oversaw periods of immense cultural and architectural growth. They commissioned the first monumental stone temples, such as the majestic Temple of Aphaia on Aegina, where the transition from wood to stone marked the permanence of the city's devotion to the divine. They patronized the poets and artists, fostering an environment where the individual voice began to emerge from the collective myths of the past. Nowhere was the path of the polis more distinct or more rigorous than in the valley of the Herodotus, where Sparta began to forge its unique destiny. While other cities looked to the sea, Sparta looked to the land, specifically the fertile plains of Mycenae. Through a series of brutal conflicts, the Spartans subjugated their neighbors, transforming them into helots, state-owned serfs who tilled the earth, so that every Spartan citizen could devote his entire life to the art of war. This system was attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, who was said to have received the great Retra from the oracle at Delphi. The Spartan life became one of total austerity, a rejection of the gold and luxury seen in the Mycenaean graves in favor of a mirage of equality and martial perfection. From the age of 7, boys entered the Agoge, a brutal training regime designed to strip away the individual and leave only the soldier. In contrast, across the Saronic Gulf, Athens was grappling with its own internal crises through a different lens. The Athenian plain was fertile but plagued by debt slavery, where poor farmers were losing their land and their freedom to a wealthy few. In the early 6th century BCE, the city stood on the precipice of civil war. The solution came not through a tyrant, but through the appointment of Solon as a mediator. Solon, a poet and a statesman, introduced the Sysaxia, the shaking off of burdens, which canceled debts and abolished the practice of using one's own person as collateral. He reorganized the citizen body not by birth, but by wealth, creating a ladder of political participation that laid the first, tentative stones of the democratic path. As the archaic period reached its zenith, the Greek world was a shimmering mosaic of such experiments. From the military barracks of Sparta to the debating floors of Athens, the concept of the citizen was being defined through law, through art, and through the shared experience of the Panhellenic games. The silence of the Dark Age had been replaced by a chorus of voices, each city-state a distinct melody in a complex symphony. But even as they celebrated their newfound strength and cultural brilliance, a shadow was beginning to grow in the east, a vast, imperial power that had never known the freedom of the polis. The era of internal formation was ending, and the era of the great external struggle was about to begin, as the borders of the Greek world prepared to collide with the reaches of the Persian Empire. As the borders of the Greek world collided with the reaching shadows of the Persian Empire, the air itself seemed to grow heavy with the weight of an impending, existential struggle. The Achaemenid Empire, a vast and multi-ethnic colossus that stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Hellespont, was unlike anything the Greeks had ever encountered. It was an empire built on the absolute authority of the great king, a figure whose power was divine and whose resources were seemingly infinite. While the Greek polis was an experiment in the messy, vibrant equality of citizens, the Persian world was one of meticulous hierarchy and subservience. This was not merely a conflict of territory, but a clash of two fundamentally different ways of being human. The friction began in Ionia, on the western coast of Asia Minor, where the Greek cities that had flourished under Persian satraps finally felt the yoke of tribute and tyranny grow too heavy. The Ionian Revolt, sparked in the final years of the 6th century BCE, was a desperate plea for autonomy that drew the attention of mainland Greece. When the Athenians and Eretrians sent ships to aid their Ionian kin, resulting in the accidental burning of the regional capital at Sardis, the great king Darius vowed a vengeance that would span a generation. Legend tells us he commanded a servant to whisper into his ear 3 times at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." This was the beginning of the Persian Wars, a series of encounters that would force the Greeks to decide if their shared language and religion were enough to bridge the fierce independence of their individual cities. In 490 BCE, the first great storm broke upon the shores of Attica. A Persian fleet, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers and horses, landed on the plain of Marathon. The Athenians stood almost alone, their messengers having run hundreds of miles to Sparta, only to be told that the Lacedaemonians could not march until the moon was full. Imagine the tension on that plain, the Greeks, heavily armored in bronze, looking out at the vast Persian camp where the air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar spices and the neighing of foreign steeds. The Persians relied on the bow and the horse, fast, lethal, and distant, while the Greeks relied on the physical weight of the phalanx. When the charge finally came, the Athenians did the unthinkable. They ran. They broke into a run across the open plain to close the distance before the Persian archers could find their range. The sound must have been terrifying, the rhythmic clashing of bronze shields and the heavy, synchronized thud of boots on the sun-baked earth. In the center, the Persians pushed back, but the Athenian wings folded inward, trapping the imperial forces in a deadly bronze embrace. The victory at Marathon was more than a tactical triumph. It was a psychological revelation. It proved that the great king was not invincible and that the free citizen soldier, fighting for his own hearth and laws, possessed a strength that no conscripted army could match. But the silence that followed Marathon was a deceptive one. For 10 years, the Greek world lived in the shadow of a returning storm. Darius's son Xerxes spent a decade preparing a massive invasion by both land and sea, a force so large that the historians of the time claimed it drank the rivers dry as it passed. In Athens, a visionary leader named Themistocles recognized that the future of the city lay not in its hoplites, but in its wooden walls, its navy. Using a sudden windfall from the silver mines at Laurium, he persuaded the assembly to build a fleet of triremes, the most advanced naval vessels of the ancient world. These were sleek, fast ships powered by 3 banks of rowers, designed not just for transport, but as projectiles for ramming. As Xerxes' host crossed the Hellespont, lashing the sea with chains in a display of hubris that chilled the Greek heart, a small, desperate alliance began to form. In the summer of 480 BCE, the struggle reached its most iconic and harrowing chapter at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Here, King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, alongside a few thousand allies, stood as a human dam against the Persian tide. The pass was so narrow that the Persian numerical advantage was nullified, forcing them to fight the Spartans on equal terms. For 3 days, the immortal guards of the king broke against the Spartan shields like waves against a cliff. The Spartans, fighting in their crimson cloaks, moved with a lethal, practiced grace, their spears finding the gaps in the light Persian armor. Even when betrayed by a local guide who showed the Persians a mountain path to bypass their position, the Spartans did not flee. They stayed to the last man, fulfilling their laws and buying precious time for the rest of Greece to mobilize. The epitaph later carved into the stone there remains one of the most haunting calls of antiquity. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. While Leonidas held the pass, the Greek fleet engaged the Persians in the churning waters off Cape Artemisium, testing the strength of their new triremes in a series of brutal, inconclusive skirmishes. The fall of Thermopylae left the road to Athens open. Xerxes marched into a city that had been largely evacuated, its citizens huddled on the nearby islands and on the decks of their ships. He put the Acropolis to the torch, the smoke of the ancient temples rising into the Attic sky as a symbol of apparent Persian triumph. But Themistocles had a plan. He lured the massive, unwieldy Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis, where their superior numbers became their greatest weakness. Xerxes sat on a golden throne perched on the slopes of Mount Aegaleos, prepared to watch his navy crush the Greek rebels. Instead, he watched a nightmare. In the confined space of the strait, the agile Greek triremes, driven by the rhythmic up-up of the oar masters, turned the sea into a chaotic graveyard of splintered wood and drowning men. The Persian ships, unable to maneuver, collided with one another, becoming easy targets for the bronze-sheathed rams of the Athenians. By nightfall, the pride of the Persian navy was shattered. Xerxes, fearing that the Greeks might sail to the Hellespont and destroy his bridges, retreated to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius to conclude the war with a land army. The final resolution came a year later, in 479 BCE, on the plains of Plataea. Here, the largest Greek army ever assembled, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, met the remaining Persian forces in a grueling, multi-day battle. It was a victory of endurance and heavy armor. The Persian cavalry, once the terror of the East, could not break the wall of Spartan and Athenian shields. At the same time, across the sea at Mycale, the Greek fleet destroyed what remained of the Persian navy on the shores of Ionia. The threat was finally expelled, and for the first time in history, the concept of Europe had defended its borders against the absolute power of the East. The aftermath of these wars did not bring a simple peace, it brought a transformation. The Greeks emerged from the struggle with a new sense of their own potential and a burgeoning identity as the defenders of freedom. Athens, whose city had been burned but whose spirit had been the architect of the naval victory, found itself the head of a new alliance, the Delian League. This league, originally formed to continue the fight against Persia and liberate the Ionian cities, would soon become something much more complex. The silver that had once paid for the wooden walls began to flow into Athens in the form of tribute, setting the stage for a period of cultural and architectural splendor that would define the Golden Age. The shadow of the great king had retreated, but in its place, a new kind of power was rising, as the city of the Violet Crown prepared to turn its wartime resilience into a masterpiece of imperial and philosophical brilliance. The city of the Violet Crown, standing amidst the settling dust of the Persian retreat, did not merely rebuild its walls. It sought to immortalize the very spirit of its resilience in stone, light, and thought. The silver that had once been destined for the wooden walls of the navy now began to flow into the heart of the city through the veins of the Delian League. What had begun as a defensive alliance of Aegean states, headquartered on the sacred island of Delos, was gradually, almost imperceptibly, transforming into an Athenian maritime empire. By 454 BCE, the treasury was moved from the sanctuary of Apollo to the heights of the Athenian Acropolis, a symbolic act that signaled the dawn of a period of unparalleled cultural and architectural splendor, the High Classical Age. Under the leadership of Pericles, a man whose eloquence was said to strike like lightning, Athens prepared to become the school of Hellas, a city that would define the aesthetic and intellectual boundaries of the Western world for millennia to come. Imagine the Acropolis as it was during this golden meridian. It was no longer the blackened ruin left by Xerxes, but a vast, elevated pedestal for the divine. The centerpiece of this transformation was the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the virgin goddess. This was not simply a building. It was a masterpiece of mathematical harmony and optical illusion. The architects, Ictinus and Callicrates, understood that the human eye is easily deceived by straight lines. To ensure the temple appeared perfect, they employed entasis, a subtle swelling in the columns, and tilted the entire structure slightly inward. Every block of Pentelic marble was carved with such precision that the joints were nearly invisible to the naked eye. Within the cella stood the colossal chryselephantine statue of Athena, crafted by the master sculptor Phidias, her skin made of ivory and her garments of shimmering gold, reflecting the flickering light of oil lamps in a pool of water designed to maintain the humidity for the precious materials. As you walk through the monumental gateway of the Propylaea, the scent of incense from the smaller temples, like the elegant, Ionic temple of Athena Nike, mingles with the salty breeze blowing from the Piraeus. Below the sacred rock, the city hummed with a different kind of energy. In the theater of Dionysus, nestled into the southern slope, the citizens gathered not just for entertainment, but for a civic ritual of deep introspection. This was the era of the great tragedians, Sophocles and Euripides, whose plays explored the fragile boundary between human agency and divine fate. They told stories of ancient kings like Agamemnon and the wandering Odysseus, reimagining the myths of the Bronze Age to reflect the complex political and moral dilemmas of the imperial present. The theater was a space where the logic of the polis met the primal echoes of the mythic past, asking what it meant to be just in a world of power. This quest for justice and order found its most profound expression in the shifting landscape of philosophy. In the bustling agora, amidst the stalls of olive merchants and the clinking of silver obols, those distinctive coins stamped with the owl of Athena, a new kind of inquiry was taking root. The focus began to turn away from the physical origins of the universe and toward the nature of the soul and the ideal society. This intellectual movement would eventually find its voice in the dialogues that explored the structure of the Republic. These discussions were not abstract. They were urgent responses to the lived experience of Athenian democracy. They envisioned a city governed by reason, where the philosopher-king acted as a guardian of the collective good, reflecting the Greek desire for a perfect, geometric harmony in the soul, much like the patterns on the Attic red figure vases that were now being exported to every corner of the Mediterranean. The art of this period reached a state of serene detachment, a style where the human form was idealized to reflect a divine equilibrium. One might look upon a sculpture like the Bartlett Head, with its heavy-lidded eyes and tranquil expression, and see the embodiment of Sophrosyne, the virtue of self-control and balance. The marble seemed to lose its coldness, becoming a medium for the expression of a timeless, interior life. This was the era of the athlete and the citizen soldier, where physical perfection was seen as a reflection of moral excellence. Even the smallest objects, from the delicate gold jewelry found in the graves to the intricate scenes of daily life painted on ceramic vessels, whispered of a society that had found its center. Yet, this brilliance was fueled by a growing and dangerous paradox. The democracy that allowed the Athenian citizen to debate in the assembly was sustained by the tribute of subjects and the labor of the unfree. The very walls that protected the city, the long walls that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus, were seen by other Greeks as the arms of a tyrant city. In the Peloponnese, the Spartans watched the rise of the Athenian naval empire with a growing, cold-eyed suspicion. The mirage of Spartan austerity stood in stark contrast to the marble opulence of the Periclean program. The balance of power, so carefully maintained since the Persian Wars, was beginning to tip. The friction manifested first in small, proxy conflicts and trade disputes, but the underlying cause was what historians of the time recognized as the inevitable growth of Athenian power and the fear it inspired in Lacedaemon. The peace was becoming a hollow shell, while the philosophers debated the nature of the good, and the architects finished the intricate friezes of the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina. The generals were already counting their triremes and stockpiling grain. The city of the Violet Crown was at its zenith, but the clouds of a long and devastating winter were gathering on the horizon. The Golden Age, for all its light, was about to enter the crucible of a conflict that would pit brother against brother and turn the sapphire waters of the Aegean into a theater of exhaustion. As the sun began to set on this period of supreme confidence, the shadows lengthened over the long walls. The era of creation was slowly, inevitably, being eclipsed by the era of destruction, as the Greek world prepared for a war that would test the very foundations of the polis and leave nothing unchanged in its wake. The shadows that lengthened over the long walls were not merely the heralds of evening, but the onset of a winter that would last 27 years, chilling the very soul of the Greek world. The sapphire waters of the Aegean, once the vibrant highway of Athenian commerce and art, transformed into a theater of exhaustion as the Peloponnesian War began to dismantle the delicate equilibrium of the polis. It was a struggle that Thucydides, the silent observer of this decline, would characterize as a motion greater than any before it, a fever that consumed the Hellenic body politic. The confidence of the Periclean age, which had sought to harmonize the human and the divine in marble, was now forced to confront the raw, unadorned reality of survival. The long walls, those twin veins of stone connecting Athens to the Piraeus, became both a shield and a cage, as the city prepared to withstand the ironclad resolve of Sparta. Every year, as the grain ripened under the Attic sun, the horizon would darken with the smoke of burning olive groves. The Spartan king Archidamus would lead the Peloponnesian host across the borders of Attica, their heavy bronze shields glinting with a purposeful, lethal intent. From the safety of the battlements, the Athenian citizens watched in silent agony as the ancestral lands they tilled, the source of their wine and their oil, were methodically laid to waste. Pericles' strategy was one of cold, rational restraint. He abandoned the countryside to the enemy, huddling the entire population within the city walls and relying on the wooden walls of the navy to bring in sustenance from the Black Sea and Egypt. The atmosphere inside the city became dense and claustrophobic. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and the mounting anxiety of a people accustomed to the open freedom of their plains. In the second year of this siege, a terror arrived that no wall could exclude. It began in the Piraeus, whispered among the sailors and merchants, before sweeping through the crowded streets of Athens like an invisible fire. The Great Plague was a catastrophe that defied the logic of the physicians and the prayers of the priests. It was a visceral, harrowing pestilence that stripped away the thin veneer of social order. Those who were once the architects of the Golden Age were now reduced to a primal struggle for breath. The temples, once the pinnacle of aesthetic harmony, became filled with the dying, their marble floors stained by the reality of human frailty. Among the victims was Pericles himself, the first citizen whose eloquence had sustained the city's spirit. With his passing, the guiding hand of reason was replaced by the volatile voices of demagogues. Men like Cleon, who favored the sharp, impulsive edge of the sword over the measured wisdom of the assembly. As the war progressed, the very nature of conflict began to shift. The noble, synchronized clash of the hoplite phalanx, which had defined the archaic and Persian eras, gave way to a more shadow-filled and irregular form of violence. It became a war of night raids, naval ambushes, and the brutal suppression of smaller states. The Hellenic spirit was tested in places like Corcyra, where internal factions tore the city apart in a bloody stasis, proving that the divisions between democracy and oligarchy were deeper than any shared bloodline. The Athenian triremes, once symbols of liberation against Persia, were now used to enforce the submission of allies who dared to seek neutrality. In the cold light of the Melian dialogue, the Athenians articulated a new, darker philosophy, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The serene detachment of the classical sculptures was being replaced by the jagged, realistic lines of a world in pain. The turning point of this long tragedy arrived in 415 BCE, born of a grand, hubristic ambition that would have seemed impossible only a generation before. Encouraged by the charismatic and reckless Alcibiades, the Athenians voted to launch a massive expedition to Sicily. It was the largest fleet ever assembled by a single polis, a shimmering display of naval power intended to conquer the distant city of Syracuse and secure the resources of the West. Imagine the scene at the Piraeus, the triremes painted in vibrant reds and blues, the decks crowded with hoplites and polished bronze, and the shore lined with thousands of citizens cheering for a victory that would supposedly end the war. It was a moment of supreme confidence, a dream of empire that overlooked the logistical nightmare of the vast, open sea. The Sicilian expedition would become the graveyard of the Athenian dream. For 2 years, the struggle around the walls of Syracuse drained the city's treasury and its manpower. The once invincible Athenian navy found itself trapped in the great harbor, its agility nullified by the fortified prows of the Syracusan ships. The final retreat was a nightmare of thirst and exhaustion under the unforgiving Sicilian sun. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were captured and cast into the deep stone quarries of Aegina, where they perished in the heat and filth, their only solace the recitation of verses from Euripides to their captors. The loss was total. The silver that had paid for the Parthenon was gone, and the flower of Athenian youth lay buried in foreign soil. Yet, Athens did not collapse immediately. With a resilience that bordered on the miraculous, the city melted down the gold from the statues of Nike to build a final fleet and continued to fight for another 8 years. But the landscape of the war had changed. The old enemy, the Persian Empire, had returned to the fray, not with soldiers, but with gold, funding the construction of a Spartan navy. Under the command of the brilliant and pragmatic Lysander, the Spartans finally mastered the sea. In 405 BCE, at the Hellespontine waters of Aegospotami, the last Athenian fleet was caught off guard and destroyed in a single afternoon. The end came in 404 BCE. Starved into submission and stripped of its allies, Athens surrendered. The terms were harsh. The long walls were to be demolished, the fleet reduced to 12 ships, and the democracy replaced by a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. As the walls were torn down to the sound of flute players, many in Greece believed that this was the birth of true freedom. But the victory of Sparta was a hollow one. The Greek world was exhausted, its treasuries empty, and its social fabric tattered. The silver obols that once signified the pride of the polis were now scarce, and the great temples stood as silent witnesses to a vanished unity. As the smoke of the final fires cleared, the survivors looked upon a landscape that was both familiar and utterly transformed. The age of the independent, supreme city-state was drawing to a close, leaving a void that would soon be filled by new and different powers. The silence that settled over the Aegean was not the peaceful quiet of the past, but the uneasy stillness of a world waiting for a new direction. The ruins of the Golden Age remained, haunting the memory of those who lived through the winter of the Peloponnesian War, as they sought to find meaning in the fragments of their shattered ideals, while a new and formidable shadow began to stir in the rugged north of Macedonia. The uneasy stillness that followed the demolition of the long walls was not the silence of a new beginning, but the heavy, exhausted hush of a world that had forgotten how to live in peace. As the flute players' melodies faded into the Attic night in 404 BCE, the Greeks found that the liberation promised by Sparta was a bitter, iron-tasting fruit. The era of the independent, supreme city-state, which had reached its zenith in the marble splendor of the Parthenon, was now entering a twilight of fragmentation and disillusionment. The 4th century BCE opened not with a renewal of the Hellenic spirit, but with a series of brutal experiments in power. As the victors struggled to manage a hegemony they were never designed to hold, and the vanquished sought to find meaning in the ruins of their shattered ideals. In Athens, the immediate aftermath of the war was a nightmare of internal purging. The Spartan victor, Lysander, had imposed a narrow oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, led by the brilliant but cold-blooded Critias. This was a period of systemic terror, where the 30 sought to dismantle the democratic identity of the city by executing thousands of citizens and seizing their property. The Agora, once the heart of free debate and the clinking of silver obols, became a place of fear and silent observation. Yet, the spirit of the polis proved remarkably resilient. Within a year, a band of democratic exiles led by Thrasybulus fought their way back from the borders, reclaiming the city and declaring a general amnesty, one of the first recorded in history, in an attempt to heal the deep, bleeding wounds of civil strife. Athens was free again, but it was a wounded freedom, haunted by the memory of its lost empire and the physical reality of its empty treasury. As the city sought to rebuild its soul, the intellectual landscape began to undergo a profound shift. The public execution of Socrates in 399 BCE, on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, acted as a traumatic coda to the failures of the 5th century. It signaled the end of an era where philosophy was conducted in the open air of the market. From this trauma emerged the voice of Plato, whose Republic would become the defining philosophical text of this age of uncertainty. Plato turned away from the messy, volatile politics of the street and began to construct a city in the soul. In the quiet groves of the academy, the focus of inquiry moved from the physical world toward the eternal forms, seeking an ideal justice that the wars and tyrannies of men had failed to provide. The Platonic dialogues became the new architecture of the Greek mind, a labyrinth of thought designed to find a stability that the shifting alliances of the polis could no longer guarantee. While Athens turned inward, Sparta found itself trapped by its own victory. The Lycurgan mirage of equality and austerity was incompatible with the realities of empire. Spartan commanders, sent to govern distant cities, were quickly corrupted by the gold and luxury they had been trained to despise. The Spartan hegemony was characterized by a clumsy and arrogant overreach, as they attempted to play the role of the great king themselves. This arrogance eventually led back to the very power they had supposedly defeated, Persia. The great king, realizing that a fragmented Greece was easier to control than a united one, began to funnel gold to whatever city-state was currently opposing Sparta. By 387 BCE, the king's peace was signed, a humiliating treaty where the Greeks essentially conceded control of the Ionian cities back to the Persian Empire, effectively undoing the victories of Marathon and Salamis a century earlier. The friction of the 4th century, however, was not limited to the old rivalry between Athens and Sparta. A third power was rising from the central plains of Boeotia, Thebes. Under the visionary leadership of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes began to challenge the military orthodoxy of the time. Epaminondas was a philosopher general, a man who combined deep intellectual discipline with tactical brilliance. He recognized that the Spartan phalanx was not an invincible wall, but a machine that could be broken through concentrated force. He cultivated the Sacred Band, an elite unit of 150 pairs of lovers, whose bond of loyalty was intended to create an unbreakable front in the heat of battle. The climax of this Theban resurgence arrived in 371 BCE on the field of Leuctra. In a revolutionary move, Epaminondas massed his ranks 50 men deep on his left wing, directly opposite the Spartan king Cleombrotus and his elite guards. When the two armies collided, the sheer physical weight of the Theban column shattered the Spartan line, killing the king and shattering the myth of Spartan invincibility forever. The aftermath of Leuctra was even more devastating than the battle itself. Epaminondas marched into the Peloponnese and did the unthinkable. He liberated Mycenae. For the first time in nearly 400 years, the Helots were free. They built a new city, Mycenae, with massive stone walls that stood as a permanent monument to the end of Spartan dominance. Without their serf population to till the earth, the Spartan system collapsed from within, reduced to a second-rate power haunting the shadows of its own history. Yet, the Theban hegemony was brief, a flash of lightning that faded after the death of Epaminondas at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE. The Greek world was left in a state of acrisia, a confusion of power where no single city was strong enough to lead, but all were strong enough to continue the cycle of violence. This exhaustion is reflected in the art and archaeology of the mid-4th century. The serene detachment of the Periclean sculptures began to give way to a more emotive, individualistic style. One can see this shift in works like the Bartlett Head, where the marble captures a sense of interior life and a hint of pathos that was absent in the idealized forms of the previous century. The Attic red figure vases of this era grew more ornate, their scenes often moving away from the grand myths toward domestic intimacy and the private world of the soul. Economic life, too, was transforming. The traditional citizen soldier, the farmer who took up his shield to defend his own valley, was increasingly replaced by the mercenary. War had become a professional trade, and the land was filled with men of the sword, who owed their loyalty not to a polis, but to whoever could pay in gold or silver. The shared identity of the Greek world was becoming professionalized and detached from the soil. The great sanctuaries like the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina still stood, and the silver obols still circulated, but the civic religious fervor that had built them was cooling into a more personal, perhaps more desperate, form of devotion. As the sun began to set on this century of internal strife and philosophical searching, the eyes of the Greeks began to turn, almost imperceptibly, toward the rugged, forested hills of the north. For generations, Macedonia had been viewed as a peripheral, semi-barbaric kingdom, a place of timber and wild horses that spoke a rough dialect of Greek, but lacked the sophisticated structure of the polis. But under the shadow of the southern wars, a new kind of power was being forged in the court at Pella. A young and ambitious king named Philip II, who had spent time as a hostage in Thebes and observed the tactics of Epaminondas firsthand, was beginning to modernize his army and consolidate his borders. The era of the independent city-state, with its debates in the Agora and its hoplite phalanxes, was unknowingly approaching its final act. The internal exhaustion of the 4th century had created a void, a longing for a stability that the polis could no longer provide. As the Greek cities continued their intricate dances of alliance and betrayal, the sound of the Macedonian sarissa, a massive 18-foot pike, was beginning to echo through the northern passes. The world was preparing to transition from the intimacy of the city-state to the vast, sprawling reality of an empire, as the stage was set for the rise of a figure who would carry the Greek language and the Platonic ideals to the ends of the known world. The sound of the Macedonian sarissa, that massive 18-foot pike, was no longer a distant echo but a steady, rhythmic thrumming that drew closer with every season, signaling the arrival of a force that would irrevocably alter the landscape of the Aegean. In the rugged, timber-clad mountains of the north, Philip II was not merely building an army. He was re-engineering the very concept of power. He had watched the Greeks exhaust themselves in the Peloponnesian and Boeotian wars, learning from the tactical brilliance of Epaminondas while held as a hostage in Thebes. Now back in his capital of Pella, he was applying those lessons with a cold, northern efficiency. The old hoplite phalanx, with its heavy bronze shields and short spears, was being superseded. In its place, Philip introduced a formation of professional soldiers, armed with the sarissa, which allowed them to strike long before their enemies could reach them. It was a forest of iron, an impenetrable barrier that moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace across the plains of Macedonia. As this new force consolidated the northern borders, the atmosphere in the southern city-states grew increasingly fraught. In Athens, the silver obols, those distinctive coins stamped with the owl of Athena, still circulated in the Agora, but the pride of the citizen soldier was being eroded by a growing sense of vulnerability. Demosthenes, the orator whose words were said to carry the weight of an army, climbed the Pnyx to deliver his fiery philippics. He warned of the man from Macedon, characterizing him not as a fellow Greek, but as a threat to the very essence of the polis. Yet, the city was divided. Many saw in Philip a potential savior, a strong hand who could finally bring an end to the centuries of internal strife and lead a united Greece against their ancient Persian enemy. This was a time of intense diplomatic maneuvering, where gold and rhetoric were as much a part of the struggle as spears and shields. Philip was a master of this silver-tongued warfare. He did not always strike with his army. Often, he struck with his treasury. He bought influence in the councils of the Greeks, playing one city against another until the once proud autonomy of the polis was tangled in a web of Macedonian alliances. By 338 BCE, the tension had reached its breaking point. A coalition of Athenians, Thebans, and other allies gathered on the plains of Chaeronea to make one final, desperate stand for the independence of the city-state. It was a gray, misty morning when the two worlds collided. The Battle of Chaeronea was the funeral of the old Greek world. On one side stood the citizen soldiers of the south, including the legendary sacred band of Thebes, who stood together with the same unbreakable loyalty they had shown at Leuctra. On the other side was the Macedonian machine. At the height of the struggle, a young man of 18 years, Philip's son Alexander, led a devastating cavalry charge that shattered the Allied line. The sacred band fell where they stood, refusing to retreat, their bodies forming a final, tragic wall of flesh and bronze. When the sun set over the carnage at Chaeronea, the era of the independent polis had effectively ended. The Greeks were no longer masters of their own destiny. They were subjects of a hegemony. Philip, however, was a pragmatic victor. He did not occupy the cities or destroy their institutions. Instead, he summoned the representatives of the Greek states to the Isthmus of Corinth. There, he established the League of Corinth, a pan-Hellenic federation with himself as the hegemon, or supreme commander. The king's peace was replaced by a Macedonian peace, and for the first time since the Persian Wars, the Greeks were technically unified. But the price of this unity was the loss of that fierce, local freedom that had built the Parthenon and fueled the debates of the Academy. The focus of the Greek world was no longer inward, but outward. Philip announced a grand, ambitious plan: a retaliatory invasion of the Persian Empire, a crusade to liberate the Ionian cities and punish the East for the crimes of Xerxes. The preparations for this invasion were immense. The shipyards hummed with the construction of new fleets, and the foundries worked day and night to produce the gear of war. Philip was at the height of his glory, celebrating the marriage of his daughter in the ancient capital of Aegina in 336 BCE. Imagine the scene: a magnificent procession into the theater, the king walking unprotected among his people to show his confidence and his power. But in a sudden, shocking moment that remains shrouded in historical mystery and court intrigue, a member of his own bodyguard stepped forward and plunged a dagger into Philip's heart. The master of the north, the architect of the Macedonian hegemony, was dead. The silence that followed the assassination was brief and terrifying. The Greek world held its breath, wondering if the Macedonian house would collapse under the weight of its own internal rivalries. But they had underestimated the young man who had led the charge at Chaeronea. Alexander, at only 20 years old, moved with a lightning speed that left his rivals and the rebellious cities paralyzed. He secured the throne, crushed a revolt in Thebes with a brutal efficiency that left the city a ruin, and stood before the League of Corinth to be confirmed as his father's successor. He was no longer just a prince. He was a king who carried the logic of Aristotle and the epic dreams of the Iliad in his heart. Alexander did not just inherit his father's army, he inherited his dream of the East. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with a force of 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. When he reached the shores of Asia, he cast a spear into the soil, claiming the land as won by the spear. This was not just a military campaign, it was a cultural explosion. Alexander brought with him scientists, historians, and philosophers, intending to map and understand the world as much as he intended to conquer it. The Greek language, which had been nurtured in the valleys of the Peloponnese and the streets of Athens, was about to become the lingua franca of a vast, multi-continental empire. The first major test came at the river Granicus, where Alexander led his companion cavalry into the churning waters against a Persian force that held the high ground. It was a moment of reckless, personal bravery that nearly cost him his life, but his victory sent a shockwave through the satrapies of the East. One by one, the cities of Ionia were liberated, their ancient connections to the mainland restored under a new Macedonian protectorate. Alexander moved like a force of nature, untying the legendary Gordian knot with a single stroke of his sword, a symbol that he would rule the world not through ancient ritual, but through decisive action. As he moved deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire, the scale of his ambition began to transform. He was no longer just a Greek hegemon. He was becoming something much more complex. He sought to integrate the cultures he encountered, adopting Persian dress and encouraging his soldiers to marry into the local populations. This was a vision of a universal city, a world where the boundaries between the Greek and the barbarian were beginning to blur. The traditional markers of identity, like the Attic red figure vases or the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina, remained as prestigious relics, but the world they belonged to was being stretched across horizons previously unimaginable. The world was standing on the precipice of an expansion that would dwarf the history of the polis. The intimacy of the village and the city-state was being swallowed by the vastness of an empire that would soon stretch to the Indus River. Alexander was the bridge between the old world of the Aegean and a new, Hellenistic reality that would define the centuries to come. As the Macedonian army marched toward the sun, the spirit of Greece was being carried into the shadows of the East, preparing to plant the seeds of its philosophy, its art, and its language in soils that had never known the sound of the Greek tongue. As the Macedonian army marched deeper toward the sun, the spirit of Greece was carried into the long, stretching shadows of the East, transforming from the intimate concerns of the local polis into a vast, shimmering dream of a universal empire. The soldiers, their bronze armor, now scarred by the sands of the Persian interior and the humidity of the Indus, found themselves moving through landscapes that defied the geometric logic of their homelands. The rugged limestone peaks of the Peloponnese had been replaced by the dizzying heights of the Hindu Kush and the endless, fertile plains of Mesopotamia. Alexander, no longer merely the king of Macedon or the hegemon of the Greeks, was becoming a figure of mythic proportions, a man who sought to weave the tapestry of the world into a single, seamless garment. This was the moment of the great synthesis, where the Greek language, which had once echoed in the small assembly grounds of Athens, began to take root in the soil of distant satrapies, preparing to become the lingua franca of a new, Hellenistic age. Imagine the atmosphere within the Macedonian camp as it reached the banks of the Hydaspes. The air was thick, not with the dry scent of wild thyme, but with the heavy, damp heat of the monsoon. Here, the Greeks encountered a force they had only heard of in the tales of travelers, the war elephants of King Porus. The battle was a nightmare of mud and screaming metal, a struggle that tested the very limits of the Macedonian Sarissa. Though victorious, the spirit of the men was beginning to fray. At the Hyphasis River, the edge of the known world, the soldiers who had followed Alexander for 8 years and thousands of miles finally stood still. They did not rebel with swords, but with silence, a profound, collective exhaustion that even the eloquence of a king could not break. Alexander, retreating to his tent in a fury of disappointment, eventually conceded. The march toward the edge of the great outer ocean was abandoned, and the long, grueling journey back through the Gedrosian desert began. The return to Babylon in 323 BCE was marked by a heavy, atmospheric tension. The city, with its towering ziggurats and its blue-glazed Ishtar Gate, was intended to be the capital of this new, integrated world. But the air in the palace was thick with omens and the scent of stagnant water from the nearby marshes. Alexander was a man haunted by the loss of his closest companion, Hephaestion, and his own identity was increasingly blurred by the adoption of Persian court rituals. The proskynesis, the act of bowing before the king, which was standard in the East, was seen by his Greek officers as a blasphemous violation of the equality they had once shared. The harmony of the polis, which sought a balance between the individual and the state, was being crushed by the weight of an absolute, godlike monarchy. In the height of the Babylonian summer, a sudden fever took hold of the king. The silence that descended upon the palace of Nebuchadnezzar was absolute. As Alexander lay dying, unable to speak, his generals gathered around his bed, asking to whom he bequeathed his vast empire. His whispered reply, "To the strongest," would act as the starting pistol for a series of wars that would tear the world apart for the next 40 years. When the world conqueror finally breathed his last at the age of 32, the unity of his empire died with him. But the cultural seeds he had sown were already beginning to sprout in the most unexpected places. The immediate aftermath was a period of chaotic fragmentation, as the Diadochi, the successors, fought over the fragments of the Macedonian crown. Men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus, who had stood shoulder to shoulder at the Granicus and Gaugamela, now turned their sarissas against one another. This was the birth of the Hellenistic kingdoms, vast territories where Greek elites ruled over diverse, indigenous populations. The focus of the Greek world shifted decisively away from the mainland. The center of gravity moved to new, planned cities that reflected the grand, imperial ambitions of the age. Nowhere was this more evident than in Alexandria, the city founded at the mouth of the Nile. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, Alexandria became the new cultural heart of the Mediterranean. It was a city of marble and light, defined by the great Pharos lighthouse that cast its beam across the dark waters to guide the merchant ships from the Levant and Sicily. Here, the traditional Greek devotion to the gods was transformed into a devotion to knowledge. The Great Library of Alexandria was an attempt to gather every written word in the world, from the epics of Homer to the philosophical dialogues that had once been whispered in the academy. The silence of the scholars in the museum was a different kind of quiet, the silence of preservation and study, where the Greek mind sought to categorize the vast world it had recently conquered. The art and archaeology of this transition period reflect this new, more complex reality. The serene detachment of the high classical period, which had sought an idealized perfection, began to give way to a style that embraced the emotive, the individual, and the realistic. We see this shift in the portraiture of the Hellenistic kings, who wanted their features, their anxieties, their strengths, and their humanity to be captured in stone. The Bartlett Head, with its deep-set eyes and sense of interior life, serves as a poignant example of this new aesthetic. The marble no longer sought to depict a type, but a person. Even the silver obols and other currencies of the age began to change. Instead of the owl of Athena or the seal of a city, they now bore the profiles of the living monarchs, signaling a world where power was personal and absolute. This was also the era of the great synthesis in religion and thought. In the markets of Alexandria and Antioch, Greek settlers encountered the ancient wisdom of Egypt and the Near East. New deities like Serapis, who combined the features of Zeus and Osiris, were created to provide a shared spiritual language for a diverse empire. Philosophy, too, adapted to this wider, more precarious world. The Stoics and Epicureans turned away from the political life of the polis, which was now under the control of distant kings, and focused instead on the tranquility of the individual soul. The dream of the philosopher king from the earlier dialogues was being tested in a reality where kings were often patrons of the arts but masters of the sword. As the 3rd century BCE progressed, the Greek world was no longer a collection of small valleys. It was a sprawling network of trade, science, and imperial administration. The Attic red figure vases were still cherished, and the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina still stood as a monument to a simpler past. But the energy of the culture was now found in the great scientific breakthroughs of Archimedes and the vast, silk-scented trade routes that stretched toward India. The Greek language had become a bridge, connecting the Mediterranean to the heart of Asia. Yet, This Hellenistic brilliance was built on a foundation of constant warfare between the rival kingdoms. The landscape was one of spectacular wealth and desperate poverty, of high philosophy and brutal exploitation. The unity that Alexander had dreamed of was a fragile, flickering flame. As the successors continued their intricate dances of diplomacy and destruction, they were unaware that a new power was slowly rising in the west. A city on the banks of the Tiber that would one day inherit the Hellenistic world and reshape it in its own image. But for now, the Greek spirit reigned supreme from the Nile to the Indus. As the sun set over the first great era of globalization, leaving a world that was forever changed by the march of the Macedonian pikes into the eastern mist. The march of the Macedonian pikes into the eastern mist had fundamentally altered the gravity of the world. But as the sun set over the first great era of globalization, the sapphire waters of the Mediterranean were no longer a Greek lake. In the west, beyond the Ionian Sea and the rugged peaks of the Apennines, a new shadow was lengthening, one that did not speak the liquid vowels of Homer, but the stern, rhythmic consonants of Latium. For centuries, the Greeks of the mainland and the great colonies of Magna Graecia had looked toward the east for their threats and their treasures. Yet while the successors of Alexander were busy carving up the fragments of a broken empire in Babylon and Alexandria, a city on the banks of the Tiber was quietly forging a different kind of iron resolve. This was the moment when the Hellenistic world, with its soaring philosophy and its marble opulence, began its long, complex, and eventually fatal embrace with the Roman Republic. Imagine the atmosphere in the great harbor of Tarentum, the wealthiest of the Greek cities in southern Italy. The air here was still thick with the scent of expensive dyes and the salty tang of the Tyrrhenian trade routes, but the mood was one of mounting apprehension. The year was 280 BCE, and the local elite, accustomed to the protection of their ancient walls and the prestige of their Spartan ancestry, found themselves caught between their own declining power and the relentless expansion of the Roman legions. In their desperation, they turned to the east, inviting Pyrrhus of Epirus, a kinsman of Alexander and a man whose tactical brilliance was said to rival the great conqueror himself, to defend the Hellenic cause in the west. Pyrrhus arrived not just with his phalanx, but with 20 war elephants, those Lacanian oxen that represented the terrifying, exotic might of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The struggle that followed was a clash of military philosophies that echoed through the centuries. On the fields of Heraclea and Asculum, the flexible, dogged Roman maniple met the rigid, impenetrable wall of the Macedonian Sarissa. Pyrrhus won the battles, his elephants trampling the Roman lines and his pikemen pushing through the stubborn resistance of the legions, but the cost was devastating. Every victory drained the lifeblood of his army, leading to the famous lament that one more such triumph would ruin him utterly. It was a revelation for the Greek world. For the first time, they encountered a foe that did not surrender after a defeat, a society that viewed war not as a seasonal contest of kings, but as a total commitment of the state. The silver obols from Athens and the intricate currencies of the East were now meeting the heavy, utilitarian bronze of Rome, signaling a world where the grace of the polis was being challenged by the sheer weight of Roman endurance. As Pyrrhus eventually retreated to the mainland, leaving the Greek cities of Italy to their fate, the cultural center of the world remained firmly anchored in the East, specifically in the gleaming marble halls of Alexandria. While Rome was perfecting the art of the legion, the Greeks were perfecting the art of the mind. In the museum and the great library, the silence was the sound of 1,000 scrolls being unrolled, a sanctuary where the collective memory of the Hellenes was being meticulously codified. This was the age of Archimedes, whose genius in Syracuse would later turn the laws of physics into weapons of war, and of scholars who sought to map the stars and the human soul with equal precision. The traditional Attic red figure vases, once adorned with the playful movements of satyrs and the grand myths of the gods, were now becoming relics of a more intimate, perhaps more cynical, era. The art of the 3rd century BCE, exemplified by the Bartlett Head, moved away from the idealized perfection of the Periclean age toward a startling, emotive realism. The marble began to capture the weary lines around a philosopher's eyes and the heavy burden of a king's crown, reflecting a society that had seen the limits of its own ambition. Even as Rome consolidated its grip on the Italian peninsula, the prestige of Greek culture acted as a secondary, silent conquest. The Roman elite, though suspicious of Greek softness, found themselves captivated by the literature, the rhetoric, and the philosophy of the East. This was the beginning of a profound cultural alchemy. Roman generals returned from the wars in the south laden with Greek statues and accompanied by Greek tutors for their children. The Temple of Aphaia on Aegina still stood as a testament to the old archaic values, but its silent columns now watched as the very concepts of law and governance were being translated from Greek into Latin. The Hellenistic world was no longer just a geographic space. It was becoming a classical continuum, a shared intellectual heritage that would survive the rise and fall of empires. But the political reality was far harsher than the philosophical ideal. The successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Asia, continued to bleed one another white in a series of Syrian wars, oblivious to the growing storm in the west. They treated the Roman Republic as a distant, barbarian nuisance, failing to recognize that the Roman Senate was becoming the ultimate arbiter of Mediterranean affairs. When the Romans finally crossed the Adriatic to punish the Illyrian pirates, they were not just protecting their trade, they were stepping into the heart of the Greek world. One by one, the once mighty city-states of the mainland found themselves seeking Roman friendship to protect them from the ambitions of the Macedonian kings. The transition was subtle at first, a shift in the tone of the agora and the weight of the silver in the merchant's scales. The Greeks, ever the masters of diplomacy, sought to balance the power of the Roman consuls against the whims of the Hellenistic monarchs, but they were playing a dangerous game. The Roman character, forged in the fires of the Punic Wars against Carthage, was increasingly intolerant of the shifting alliances and perceived fickleness of the Greek states. The era of the independent polis, which had briefly flickered back into a semblance of life after the death of Alexander, was being squeezed between the dying light of the Macedonian hegemony and the cold, rising dawn of the Roman Empire. As the 2nd century BCE opened, the world was standing on a threshold. The great philosophical schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans, continued to offer a retreat for the individual soul, but the public life of the Greek city was becoming a theater of Roman interests. The statues of the gods still stood, and the oil lamps still flickered in the sanctuaries, but the power that had once resided in the assembly of the citizens was now increasingly found in the letters delivered by Roman legates. The strongest to whom Alexander had bequeathed his empire was being redefined, not by the length of a spear, but by the discipline of the law and the unyielding reach of the legion. Close your eyes and imagine the moon rising over the ruins of Corinth and the quiet, enduring beauty of the Parthenon. The Greek world was not vanishing, it was being absorbed, its art, its science, and its dreams becoming the bedrock of a new, global identity. The silence of the Aegean was being joined by the clamor of the Roman Forum, as the two cultures prepared for a collision that would leave the world forever altered. The sun was setting on the era of the successors, and as the stars appeared over the ruins of the old world, they illuminated a landscape where the spirit of Greece was preparing to move into its next, most enduring phase, the era when the captive would truly conquer her captor. The captive truly conquering her captor was not a singular event of war, but a slow, subterranean infiltration of the Roman soul by the enduring brilliance of the Hellenic mind. While the Roman legions were perfecting the brutal geometry of the maniple on the battlefields of the mainland, the spirit of Greece was embarking on its most profound migration. The year 197 BCE marked a pivotal chilling of the air in the hills of Thessaly, at a place called Cynocephaly, the dogs' heads. Here, under a thick, swirling mist that clung to the jagged limestone like a burial shroud, the old world of the Macedonian phalanx met the new, relentless flexibility of the Roman legion for the final time. The forest of 18-foot pikes, which had carried Alexander to the Indus, found itself immobile and fractured on the uneven ground, while the Roman soldiers, with their short stabbing swords and heavy shields, moved through the gaps like a rising tide. The defeat of Philip V of Macedon was the cracking of the Hellenistic shell, leaving the heart of Greece exposed to the cold, pragmatic wind blowing from the west. Imagine the scene a year later at the Isthmian Games near Corinth. The stadium was packed with Greeks from every corner of the Aegean, their voices a low, anxious hum of uncertainty. Suddenly, a Roman herald stepped into the center of the arena and, amidst a profound silence, proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks. For a moment, the air was electric with a joy that bordered on madness. People wept, cheered, and surged toward the Roman general, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, nearly crushing him in their gratitude. They believed the era of the polis had been restored, that the dark shadows of the Macedonian hegemony had finally been lifted. But this freedom was a delicate, translucent veil. The Greeks soon discovered that their new friends in the Roman Senate expected a devotion that was more absolute than any king had ever demanded. The silver obols from Athens and the intricate currencies of the regional leagues were slowly being shadowed by the Roman denarius, a coin that carried the weight of a new, uncompromising law. The friction between Greek intellectual pride and Roman administrative iron reached its tragic climax in 146 BCE. The Achaean League, in a final, desperate spark of the old independent spirit, challenged the Roman dictates. The response was a visceral, total destruction. The ancient and wealthy city of Corinth was not merely defeated, it was systematically erased. The Roman consul Mummius ordered the city put to the torch, its men slaughtered, and its women and children sold into slavery. The sight of Roman soldiers playing dice on the fallen masterpieces of Greek painting, works that had been the pride of the Mediterranean, marked a harrowing shift in the history of art. Thousands of statues, including the graceful marble forms that had defined the classical age, were crated and shipped to Rome to adorn the villas of the new elite. The satyr on the Attic red figure vases and the serene, heavy-lidded gaze of the Bartlett Head were now the spoils of a culture that valued the object even as it struggled to understand the philosophy behind it. Yet, in this moment of physical ruin, the cultural conquest began in earnest. As the smoke of Corinth cleared, Greece was reorganized as the province of Achaia. The centers of power moved to the Roman governors, but the centers of thought remained firmly anchored in the ancient schools. Athens, though its walls were no longer needed for defense, transformed into the most prestigious university town of antiquity. The Roman elite, from the sons of senators to the future emperors themselves, felt their education was incomplete without a journey to the school of Hellas. They walked the quiet paths of the academy and the lyceum, seeking to master the liquid vowels of Homer and the rigorous logic of the Stoics. This was the era of the Classical Continuum, where the Greek language became the essential vessel for the Roman intellectual life. Philosophy, once the radical inquiry of the Agora, now became a sanctuary for the individual living under the shadow of a global empire. The Stoicism of Zeno and the Epicureanism of the Garden were adopted by the Roman mind as tools for endurance and tranquility. Even as the Roman legions patrolled the borders of the Danube and the Euphrates, the inner lives of their commanders were being shaped by the dialogues of Plato and the ethics of Aristotle. The marble peaks of the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina stood as silent witnesses to this transition, their ancient columns watching as the Roman architecture began to borrow the Greek vocabulary of beauty. The Romans did not merely copy, They synthesized, creating a Greco-Roman world where the vault and the dome of the West were supported by the columns and the proportions of the East. By the time of the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, the captive had become the co-architect of the empire. Hadrian, a man so enamored with Greek culture that he was nicknamed the Greekling, spent years in Athens, finishing the colossal temple of Olympian Zeus and building a library that was a testament to the enduring power of the written word. This was a period of a second sophistic, a renaissance of Greek rhetoric and literature that saw authors like Plutarch weaving the lives of Greek and Roman heroes into a single, shared tapestry of human virtue and vice. The Greek spirit was no longer a regional identity. It had become the universal architecture of the educated mind. But as the centuries turned, a different kind of silence began to settle over the ancient landscape. The oracles, including the once mighty voice of Delphi, grew quiet. The traditional devotion to the Olympian gods was being challenged by new, more intimate mysteries and the rising tide of a faith that sought a kingdom not of this world. Yet, even in this transition, the Greek soul remained indispensable. The early Christian theologians, seeking to articulate the complexities of their faith, turned to the precision of Greek philosophy. The logic that had once built the Parthenon was now being used to construct the foundations of a new theological world. Close your eyes and imagine the moon rising over the ruins of the Acropolis during the twilight of the Roman peace. The silver obols have long since vanished from the markets, and the vibrant colors of the Attic vases are buried under layers of time, but the ideas they represented are indestructible. The Greek world did not end with the Roman conquest, it simply changed its medium. It moved from the stone of the citadel to the parchment of the scroll and the quiet, interior halls of human reason. The journey that had begun in the prehistoric mists of the Aegean, through the golden noon of the polis and the vast expansion of Alexander, had finally reached its state of permanence. As the Roman world itself began to fragment, the Greek language and thought would retreat to the east, to a new Alexandria, ensuring that the light of the Hellenes would continue to flicker in the shadows of the coming Middle Ages, waiting to be rediscovered by a world that would once again seek the clarity and the beauty of its ancient dawn. The flickering light in the new Alexandria of the East was not a dying ember, but a steady, guarded flame that refused to succumb to the encroaching shadows of a changing world. As the ancient structures of the West fractured, and the voices of the old polis seemed to fade into a whisper, a different kind of sanctuary was being forged in the heart of the Byzantine landscape. This was the era of the Great Preservation, a time when the Greek spirit retreated into the quiet halls of the scriptoria and the high, gilded domes of the Bosporus. The journey that had begun in the rugged valleys of the Aegean was now being transcribed onto thousands of scrolls and codices, ensuring that the 69.7 million words of the Hellenic and Roman legacy would survive the long winter of the Middle Ages. Imagine the silence of a monastic library in the 10th century, where the only sound is the rhythmic scratch of a quill against vellum. Here, in this new Alexandria, the 1,639 Greek works that formed the intellectual spine of antiquity were being meticulously copied, word by word, by scholars who saw themselves not as innovators, but as guardians of a sacred inheritance. The Odyssey of Homer, once sung in the megarons of the Bronze Age, was now being preserved in ink, its wine-dark sea flowing across the pages of Byzantine manuscripts. The Republic of Plato, which had once stirred the debates of the Athenian Academy, was being held in a state of suspended animation, its vision of the ideal state waiting for a world that would once again have the peace to contemplate it. This was the Classical Continuum, a bridge of thought and text that stretched across the centuries, connecting the marble peaks of the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina to the rising intellectual centers of the medieval world. The physical relics of the past remained, the Bartlett Head with its serene, heavy-lidded gaze, and the satyr on Attic red figure vases. but they were now silent witnesses to a culture that had moved from the stone to the spirit. The silver obol from Athens, once the currency of a vibrant, maritime democracy, was now a rare artifact, a metallic echo of a time when the polis was the center of the universe. In the east, the intellectual reach of Greece was expanding in ways the ancient philosophers could never have imagined. The works of Archimedes, whose mechanical genius had once defended Syracuse, were being studied and translated, his principles of physics and geometry becoming the foundation for the scientific revivals of the future. The histories of Herodotus, which had captured the clash of East and West, were being read by scholars who recognized that the struggle for identity was an eternal one. This was not a stagnant period. It was a time of intense cultural alchemy. The Greek language, which had become the lingua franca of Alexander's empire, was now the vessel for the most complex theological and philosophical inquiries of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. As you breathe in the cool, still air of this historical twilight, consider the sheer scale of what was being protected. Within the collections of texts that would one day become our window into the past, over 32 million words in Greek were being shielded from the fires of war and the decay of neglect. These were not just dry records, they were the living thoughts of Agamemnon's poets, the biting wit of Catullus, and the stern, legalistic precision of Caesar and Cicero. The Aeneid of Virgil, which sought to give Rome a mythic dignity equal to that of the Greeks, was held alongside the ancient Greek dramas, forming a dual foundation for the future Western mind. The landscape of the Mediterranean was still a place of trade and movement, but the focus had shifted. The ancient sites, like the ruins of the citadels described in the overview of classical Greek history, were now haunting monuments to a vanished youth. Yet the Classical Continuum ensured that the past was never truly dead. In the libraries of Constantinople and the translation centers of Baghdad, the Greek spirit was being woven into the fabric of a new, global consciousness. The ideas of justice, beauty, and the nature of the soul were being held in trust, awaiting the moment when the human spirit would again seek to break the boundaries of its own understanding. This period of silent transmission was a testament to the resilience of the human mind. The New Alexandria was not a single place, but a state of being, a commitment to the idea that knowledge is the only light that can truly pierce the darkness. As the centuries turned, the light of the Hellenes continued to flicker in the shadows, its influence felt in the architecture of the cathedrals, the logic of the universities, and the quiet, persistent curiosity of the scholars. The ancient world was preparing for its next great awakening, its voice waiting to be rediscovered by a world that would eventually call this rebirth the Renaissance. Close your eyes and listen to the rhythmic pulse of history, the steady heartbeat of a culture that refused to be forgotten. The silver obols may have been buried in the earth, and the Aphaia temple may have stood as a silent ruin, but the words were alive. They were traveling through the classical continuum, crossing the seas and the centuries, preparing to re-emerge into the light of a new day. The journey was far from over. It was merely entering a period of deep, restorative rest, as the spirit of ancient Greece prepared to speak once more to a world that was finally ready to listen. The silence of the scriptoria was the silence of growth, the quiet anticipation of a seed beneath the snow. The Greek world was not a memory. It was a promise, a beyond translation reality that would continue to shape the human story as long as there were voices to speak and ears to hear. As the stars watch over the enduring landscape of the Aegean, the light of the ancient dawn remains, a timeless beacon in the vast, unfolding mystery of the human journey. This timeless beacon, shining through the long winter of the medieval scriptoria, did not merely stay static. It began to evolve into a vast, interconnected digital consciousness, a beyond translation state where the distance between the modern mind and the ancient soul is finally being bridged. The journey of these texts, from the rhythmic breath of the oral poets to the ink-stained vellum of the monks, has now reached a new, sophisticated reading environment, a virtual New Alexandria that transcends the physical limitations of a library. We are entering an era where the 69.7 million words of our collective classical heritage are not just preserved, but are becoming a living, breathing landscape of inquiry. Imagine a silent, boundless archive where 32.1 million words in Greek and 16.3 million in Latin are meticulously organized, waiting to be rediscovered by a world that seeks the clarity and the beauty of its ancient dawn once more. This modern transformation is not a break from the past, but a fulfillment of the classical continuum that has always sought to keep the ancient voices audible. In this new phase of the work, which has been nearly 30 years in the making, the focus has shifted toward a depth of understanding that goes beyond the simple reading of a page. It is a system that allows for a scaife view of the ancient world, a perspective that provides exhaustive syntactic explanations and alignments at the word and phrase level between the original source and its translation. When you look upon the text of the Odyssey or the Histories of Herodotus today, you are not merely seeing words. You are seeing a delicate web of connections, where every verb and every noun is linked to its historical roots, its grammatical structure, and its deep, resonant meaning. The air in this digital sanctuary is thick with the precision of a new generation of resources. Here, the traditional access to lexica and commentaries is being enhanced by dynamic maps that trace the movements of Agamemnon or the travels of Odysseus across the Aegean with a geographical accuracy that the ancient cartographers could only dream of. There are recorded performances linked directly to the text, allowing the meter and the music of the ancient tongues to vibrate in the air once more, bridging the gap between the silent scroll and the living voice. It is a world where the beyond translation concept acts as a guide, providing explanations of meter and interactive textual variants that reveal the subtle shifts in the narrative over thousands of years. As we navigate this intricate labyrinth of 2,412 works, encompassing 1,639 Greek and 636 Latin editions, the popular texts of our history begin to take on a new luminosity. The Republic of Plato is no longer just a philosophical treatise. It is an environment where the logic of the dialogue is aligned with a syntactic clarity that exposes the very bones of the argument. The Aeneid of Virgil and the Gallic Wars of Caesar are held in a state of high-definition preservation, where the Latin prose is supported by a global collaboration of researchers committed to open educational resources. This is the Perseus on the Web initiative, a 30-year preparation for a future where the next 30 years of scholarship will be built on a foundation of open-source software and a shared commitment to the preservation of the human story. The archaeology of this digital world is as rich as the physical ruins of the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina. In this reading environment, the artifacts of the past, the silver obol from Athens, the satyr on the Attic red figure vase, and the serene, heavy-lidded gaze of the Bartlett Head are not just images, but data points in a vast, interconnected catalog. They are part of a digital library that seeks to reorganize the very home of classical studies, replacing old structures with new publishing platforms that document the journey from the physical object to the digital presence. The work of reorganization is a silent, monumental task, a contract between the past and the future to ensure that the beyond is always within reach. In the quiet, focused energy of this new phase, the collaborators are like the modern-day equivalents of the ancient librarians of Alexandria. They work to fold the services of the beyond translation era into a unified viewer, a system that reflects the immense labor embedded in the transition from the old digital repositories to the new. This is a process of preparing for the next 30 years of work, supported by a diverse array of grants and institutions, from the National Endowment for the Humanities to the private study centers at Harvard and Tufts, all united by the belief that the classical continuum must never be broken. As you linger in this space, Imagine the sheer weight of the information being held in trust. The 69.7 million words are not just a number. They are a testament to the resilience of the human mind. They include the biting satire of Catullus, the legalistic precision of Cicero, and the sweeping historical narratives of the Bronze Age. They are part of a reading environment that combines deep coverage with a new generation of reading tools, offering a window into the ancient world that is more transparent than ever before. The scaife perspective allows the modern traveler to move through the text with a sense of orientation that was previously impossible, supported by syntactic explanations that act as a compass in the vast sea of the ancient languages. The silence of this digital archive is the silence of potential. It is the quiet anticipation of a reader who, with a single click, can align a word spoken by a Greek hero with its modern English equivalent, revealing the subtle shades of meaning that have survived for millennia. It is a world of preparing for the next 30 years, where the focus is on stability, accessibility, and the enduring beauty of the open source spirit. The Beyond Translation work is a draft of the future, a white paper on the immortality of ideas, ensuring that the light of the Hellenes will continue to shine, not just in the ruins of the past, but in the vibrant, interconnected consciousness of the future. The journey that began in the megarons of the Mycenaeans and moved through the scriptoria of the East has now arrived at this point of technological permanence. The New Alexandria is a place where the 32 million words of Greek and the 16 million words of Latin are no longer separate islands, but parts of a single global continent of thought. The silver obols and the Bartlett Head remain as symbols of this journey, their aesthetic perfection now matched by the mathematical precision of the digital alignment. The Classical Continuum is a reality, a bridge of texts and data that ensures the ancient dawn is always just a moment away. Close your eyes and feel the pulse of this archival work, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a culture that has successfully navigated the transition from stone to scroll to screen. The 69.7 million words are the stars in this digital sky, guiding us through the beyond translation landscape toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. The journey is far from over. It is merely expanding, its voice growing stronger as it speaks through the new viewers and the interconnected systems of the modern world. The light of the ancient dawn remains, a timeless beacon that continues to illuminate our path as we move into the next 30 years of our shared, unfolding story. This shared, unfolding story is no longer tethered to the fragile decay of physical parchment, but has found a new, resilient sanctuary within a reading environment that has been nearly 15 years in the making. Within this digital constellation, the silence of the library is replaced by the vibrant, meticulous activity of a system designed to host 2,412 works across 3,192 distinct editions and translations. To navigate this space is to move through a shimmering cosmos of 69.7 million words, where the Greek language alone accounts for over 32 million entries and the Latin tongue for more than 16 million. This is not merely an archive. It is a profound and meditative reorganization of the very home of classical studies, a transition from the rigid structures of the past to a future documented through modern, open-access publishing platforms. Imagine the intellectual depth available here, where the most popular and haunting voices of antiquity are held in a state of high-definition clarity. The military precision of Caesar's accounts of the Gallic War and the lyrical, often visceral poems of Catullus are no longer just static lines of text. They are woven into a system of exhaustive syntactic explanations that allow the reader to feel the weight of every syllable. The biting, urgent oratory of Cicero's speeches and the epic majesty of Virgil's Aeneid are aligned at the word and phrase level with their modern counterparts, allowing the listener to witness the exact, shimmering moment a thought transitions from the ancient world into our own. This is the essence of being beyond translation, a state of inquiry where the listener can access dynamic maps of the ancient world and hear the rhythmic meter of the poetry in recorded performances directly linked to the Greek and Latin texts. The labor behind this synthesis is a testament to a global, meditative collaboration that spans decades. We see the steady hand of dedicated researchers and the unwavering commitment of institutions like Signum University, all working toward a new, integrated version of this digital sanctuary, a version that reflects the massive amount of intellectual work embedded in its development. This is a journey supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a profound 30-year preparation for the next 30 years of human curiosity and scholarly devotion. It is a vision shared by the School of Arts and Sciences, Technology Services, and even the far-reaching curiosity of global researchers, all focused on the preservation and the open access of our collective heritage. Within this environment, the ancient masters, Homer with his sweeping Odyssey, Herodotus with his expansive and inquisitive Histories, and Plato with his visionary Republic, are given a new interactive life. The Beyond Translation initiative provides a microscopic gaze into these texts, offering interactive variants and explanations of the subtle shifts in meter that once vibrated through the air of the ancient polis. This is the open Greek and Latin vision, an international commitment to creating resources that ensure the light of the Hellenes and the Romans is never gated or lost to the shadows of time. As we look toward this digital horizon, we see the Classical Continuum in its most modern and enduring form. The transition away from the older frameworks toward sophisticated publishing platforms represents a commitment to documenting every step of this journey for future generations of seekers. The silence of the ancient dawn is now a collaborative, quiet chorus, where the latest viewing perspectives offer a new way of seeing the 1,639 Greek works and 636 Latin editions that have survived the arduous journey from the Bronze Age to the Silicon Age. The words are no longer just remnants. They are the living, breathing blueprint for the next 30 years of our shared unfolding story. Close your eyes and imagine the density of this knowledge. A tapestry woven from 32.1 million Greek words and 16.3 million Latin words, all supported by a global infrastructure of preservation. In this reading environment, the traditional access to lexica and commentaries is no longer a separate task, but a fluid part of the experience, allowing for a deeper coverage than ever before. The system is designed for stability and depth, ensuring that the syntactic explanations and the alignments between source and translation are available to anyone who seeks to understand the origins of Western thought. The collaborators in this phase, from the administrative offices to the technical teams, are the modern-day scribes, working to replace the older splash pages with documentation that is as enduring as the marble of the Acropolis. This work is the result of a diverse array of grants and the support of foundations dedicated to the preservation of the past, ensuring that the Beyond Translation work is not just a draft, but a permanent white paper on the immortality of ideas. It is a process of folding services and resources into a unified experience, a way of building the future while remembering the friends and scholars who have walked this path before us. In the quiet, focused energy of this archival work, the ancient world becomes a transparent landscape. The popular texts, from the histories that mapped the known world to the philosophies that sought to map the soul, are now part of a system that combines the deepest historical coverage with a new generation of tools. The Classical Continuum is a reality, a bridge of texts and data that ensures the ancient dawn is always just a moment away, waiting to be rediscovered by a world that is finally ready to listen. The journey that began in the megarons of the Mycenaeans and moved through the scriptoria of the East has now arrived at this point of technological and spiritual permanence. The New Alexandria is not a physical place, but a shared digital state of being where the 69.7 million words are the stars in a vast, illuminated sky. The light of the ancient dawn remains, a timeless beacon that continues to guide us through the beyond translation landscape toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. The journey is far from over. It is merely expanding, its voice growing stronger as it speaks through the new viewers and the interconnected systems of the modern world. The light of the ancient dawn remains, a timeless beacon that continues to illuminate our path as we move into the next 30 years of our shared unfolding story. As the next 30 years of our shared unfolding story begin to take shape, this luminous path leads us into a landscape where the distinction between the ancient scroll and the modern mind finally dissolves. The light that once flickered in the megarons of the Bronze Age has found its way into a new, sophisticated reading environment, a sanctuary of code and thought that has been nearly 15 years in the making. This is not merely a collection of data. It is a profound and meditative reorganization of the home of classical studies, a transition from the rigid physical limitations of the past toward a future documented through modern, open-access publishing platforms that ensure these voices remain as clear as the Attic air. Within this digital constellation, we find the culmination of decades of labor, a vision that sees the 69.7 million words of our heritage not as static relics, but as a living, breathing tapestry of human inquiry. Imagine navigating this vast, interconnected cosmos where 32.1 million words in Greek and 16.3 million in Latin are held in a state of high-definition clarity. To move through this space is to experience the beyond translation state of being, a realm where the distance between the listener and the ancient soul is bridged by exhaustive syntactic explanations and alignments that occur at the very level of the word and the phrase. As you contemplate the accounts of the Gallic War or the biting, urgent oratory of Cicero, the system acts as a prism, focusing the light of history through the lens of a new generation of resources. The words are no longer isolated fragments. They are supported by dynamic maps that trace the movements of heroes and recorded performances that allow the rhythmic meter of the ancient poetry to vibrate in your ears once more, exactly as it did when it was first sung under a younger moon. This monumental endeavor is the result of a global, silent collaboration, a brotherhood of preservation that transcends institutional boundaries. We see the influence of visionary thinkers and dedicated partners from Signum University to the Center for Hellenic Studies, all working in a quiet, focused synchronicity to fold the services of this beyond translation era into a unified experience. This is a journey supported by a deep well of institutional memory and a diverse array of grants, reflecting a 30-year preparation for the next 30 years of our cultural immortality. It is a vision that replaces the older structures of the digital world with a more stable, expansive home, one that utilizes the latest publishing platforms to ensure that the journey from the physical object to the digital presence is documented with the same care as a sacred ritual. Within this environment, the most popular and haunting voices of antiquity are given a new, interactive life. The Odyssey of Homer and the Republic of Plato are no longer just texts. They are environments where the logic of the dialogue and the music of the epic are aligned with a precision that was once unimaginable. You can witness the interactive textual variants, those subtle shifts in the narrative that have survived the long journey through time, and access explanations of meter that reveal the hidden heartbeat of the Greek and Latin tongues. This is the open Greek and Latin vision, an international commitment to creating a corpus of digital texts and deep reading tools that are open to anyone who seeks to understand the origins of their own spirit. As we linger in this digital sanctuary, the artifacts of our past remain as our silent companions. The Temple of Aphaia on Aegina, with its enduring columns, and the silver obol from Athens, with its metallic echo of democracy, are no longer just images. They are data points in a vast, interconnected consciousness. The Bartlett Head, with its serene and heavy-lidded gaze, watches over this transition, a symbol of the classical continuum that ensures the past is always just a moment away. We are moving away from the older splash pages of history toward a future of deep coverage and stability, where the 1,639 Greek works and 636 Latin editions are protected by a global infrastructure of scholarly devotion. The silence of this work is the silence of a profound and lasting commitment. It is the result of the immense labor embedded in the transition to this new phase, a phase that reflects the cumulative effort of researchers who have spent their lives in the scriptoria of the digital age. From the National Endowment for the Humanities to the private study centers at Harvard and Tufts, the support for this work is a testament to the belief that the light of the Hellenes must never be gated or lost to the shadows. It is a process of building the future while remembering the friends and the scholars who have walked this path before us, ensuring that the next generation of seekers will find the way clearly marked. In the quiet, focused energy of this final chapter, we see the ancient world as a transparent and welcoming landscape. The 69.7 million words are the stars in this digital sky, guiding us through the beyond translation landscape toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. The traditional access to lexica and commentaries has become a fluid, intuitive part of the experience, allowing the modern traveler to move through the text with a sense of orientation and depth that was previously impossible. This is the new Alexandria, a state of being where the 32 million words of Greek and the 16 million words of Latin are no longer separate islands, but parts of a single global continent of thought. The journey that began in the prehistoric mists of the Aegean, through the golden noon of the polis and the vast expansion of Alexander, has finally reached its state of permanence. The beyond translation work is not just a draft of the future. It is a permanent white paper on the immortality of ideas. As the Roman world and the Byzantine scriptoria once held these texts in trust, we now hold them in a decentralized, digital sanctuary that is open to the world. The light of the ancient dawn remains, a timeless beacon that continues to illuminate our path as we move into the next 30 years and beyond. Close your eyes now and feel the pulse of this archival work, the steady rhythmic heartbeat of a culture that has successfully navigated the transition from stone to scroll to screen. The silver obols and the Aphaia temple remain as the anchors of our memory, but the ideas they represent are now free to travel through the classical continuum at the speed of light. The journey is far from over. It is merely expanding, its voice growing stronger as it speaks through the new viewers and the interconnected systems of the modern world. Take a final, deep, and peaceful breath. The story of ancient Greece is not a story of the past. It is a story of the present and the future. It is a story of how we remember, how we preserve, and how we continue to seek the truth in the beauty of a well-turned phrase. The light of the ancient dawn is with you, a timeless and tranquil companion in the vast, unfolding mystery of the human journey. You are home, and the voices of the Hellenes are whispering to you in the silence, welcoming you into the eternal sanctuary of their thoughts. Sleep now, knowing that the beyond translation landscape is always there, a luminous and enduring gift to the soul that seeks to understand. As the final embers of this long journey fade into the velvet darkness of the night, the echoes of the ancient world transform into a peaceful melody in your mind. This Odyssey, which began in the rugged valleys of the Aegean and stretched into the infinite reaches of a digital sky, stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The wine-dark sea of the Odyssey and the visionary ideals of Plato's Republic are no longer just distant relics. They are part of a vast, interconnected constellation of 69.7 million words, glowing steadily in the silence. In this boundless archive, the epic breath of Homer and the inquisitive gaze of Herodotus have transcended time and language to reach across the centuries. Now let your eyes close gently and surrender to the safety of this classical continuum. The serene, heavy-lidded gaze of the Bartlett Head accompanies your rest with the wisdom of millennia. While the silver obols of Athens rest beneath the earth, these ancient thoughts are preserved in a sanctuary of light, ensuring that the dawn of human reason is never truly lost. In this quietest hour, the spirit of the ancient world remains with you, a timeless beacon whispering the enduring truth of what it means to be human. We leave you now in the meditative and tranquil embrace of that ancient soul. Stay in peace, stay in knowledge, and drift into your dreams. Good night.